Beneath the rolling hills and forgotten valleys of America lies a story most would rather never hear, a story whispered in church basements, muttered in half-drunk confessions, and buried beneath records too fragile to survive the passing of time. It begins with a family whose roots twisted so tightly inward they became impossible to untangle. A lineage where blood was never allowed to wander far, where marriages were not unions of love, but cages built to keep the name alive. Generations passed in silence, each child bearing the marks of decisions made long before they drew their first breath. What remains today is not simply history. It is a haunting reminder of what happens when isolation becomes destiny. America has long celebrated its great dynasties, the wealthy and the powerful who built monuments to their name. But in the shadows, there existed dynasties of another kind, families not known for riches or triumph, but for secrets too dark to be spoken aloud. Their legacy was one of shame and endurance, where tradition became a curse and survival meant silence. This is the story of America's most inbred lineage, a family that passed down not just their name, but their suffering in shadows that still stretch across the land. The first whispers of their existence trace back to a rural settlement where neighbors were scarce and outsiders rarer still. Theirs was a world bound by dirt roads and crumbling cabins, where the church bell tolled louder than any law. It was here that the roots of their bloodline dug deep, entwining with itself like a vine, wrapping tighter and tighter around a dying tree. In such isolation, choices became narrow, until the only choice left was family itself. Sons married cousins, daughters bore children whose fathers were uncles or brothers. What began as necessity soon hardened into tradition. The faces of these descendants tell a story without words. Eyes set too close, jaws that never quite aligned, minds that wandered through shadows darker than most could bear. And yet, within the family, there was no horror, only the rhythm of life as it had always been. They did not see monsters in the mirror. They saw themselves carrying forward what their parents had carried and what their children were destined to carry still. It is only when we, the outsiders, peer into their hidden world that the full weight of the truth settles upon us. America likes to believe its darkest chapters are hidden overseas, in foreign castles and royal bloodlines that bred themselves into sickness. But the truth is more unsettling. Right here, in the heart of the nation, families like this lived quietly, their lineage folding inward upon itself, generation after generation. And unlike the crowned royals of Europe, they had no thrones, no jewels, no history books to soften their story. All they had was survival. And survival, in their world, came at a cost that can still be felt today. By the late 19th century, their name had nearly vanished from the county records, swallowed by deliberate omission and the slow decay of paper eaten away by time. What survived were fragments, birth certificates with the same last names repeating again and again, census sheets where entire households appeared related by more than just address. Each page whispers a pattern too deliberate to ignore, a map of bloodlines doubling back on themselves like a snake eating its own tail. To the casual eye, these were simply poor farming families, tucked into the folds of Appalachia or scattered across the coal valleys. But to those who looked closer, the story grew darker. Children were born with afflictions no doctor could mend. Some came into the world with cleft lips, extra fingers, or jaws so malformed that chewing was a lifelong burden. Others bore invisible wounds, minds that struggled to hold memory, emotions that fractured like glass under the weight of everyday life. In their community, such things were not spoken of as tragedy. They were part of the order, part of what it meant to belong to this family. Outsiders might whisper, but inside the home, silence reigned. Isolation was not only geographical, it was psychological. Families like theirs lived with the quiet certainty that they were different, yet to admit it was to betray the only world they knew. Schoolteachers noticed children who could not keep up with their lessons. Neighbors remembered voices that slurred or laughter that came at the wrong times. But no one intervened. Rural America at the time was not a place of intervention. It was a place where people kept to themselves, where fences were both physical and moral boundaries. What happened on one farm was not the business of another. The years carried forward, and with them the weight of blood. Those who tried to leave often found themselves tethered by invisible chains, an aging parent who needed tending, a younger sibling who depended on them. The cycle repeated until leaving became less of a choice and more of a betrayal. For many, the idea of marrying an outsider was unthinkable. The outside world was not just distant, it was dangerous, foreign, a place that would never understand them. And so, the bloodline curled further inward, folding upon itself in silence. Generations passed like shadows across the hills, but the story was never gone. In every face, in every body, in every faltering step down a dirt road, the truth of their lineage lingered. A truth too heavy for a single family, yet one they bore together, bound by blood that never strayed too far from its source. By the early 20th century, whispers about the family had grown into uneasy folklore. Strangers passing through rural towns spoke of cabins tucked deep in the woods where pale children stared from doorways, their eyes wide and unblinking, their features strangely familiar, as though carved from the same mold. Local merchants remembered seeing them only on rare occasions, when food or supplies were needed, and even then they moved in silence, speaking little, their words slurred and uncertain. For those on the outside, it was easier to explain it away. Poverty, malnutrition, hardship, but those who had lived near them long enough knew that something deeper was at work. The human mind has a way of burying what it does not wish to face. Neighbors looked the other way, not out of cruelty but out of fear. To acknowledge the truth would be to admit that this was not an accident of fate, but a choice repeated generation after generation. Each time a cousin married a cousin, each time a brother wed his own blood, the cycle deepened. And yet, for the family themselves, this was not horror. It was continuity. Their existence was not framed in the language of sin or shame, but of necessity, as though the boundaries of their world had been drawn by hands older than memory itself. There are rare photographs that survive, grainy black and white images of gaunt figures standing before sagging porches. The faces seem blurred not by the lens, but by the uneasy weight of looking too closely. Jaws set too narrow, eyes misaligned, teeth jutting at strange angles. Children with vacant stares and awkward, stunted postures. These images were never meant to be studied. They were taken and then forgotten, filed away in dusty albums, buried in attics, only to resurface decades later as fragments of a truth too uncomfortable to deny. The family's isolation hardened into myth. Outsiders called them cursed, a word that made sense of what they could not otherwise explain. But the truth was more devastating than superstition. This was not the work of some divine punishment. It was human choice, made and remade in silence, passed down like heirlooms no one wanted, but no one dared to discard. And in this silence they carried forward, generation after generation, never asking what their survival truly cost. What remains most haunting is not the deformities, not the whispers, not even the cruel laughter of outsiders. What remains is the humanity buried beneath it all, children born into a lineage they never chose, mothers and fathers who raised them with love despite the marks etched into their very being. That is the horror. That love itself was never enough to free them from the blood that bound them. By mid-century, America was moving forward, highways cutting through farmland, factories rising in cities, televisions flickering in living rooms. Yet in the hidden pockets of the countryside, families like this remained untouched by the rush of progress. Their homes stood like relics, cabins with sagging roofs and dirt floors, places where the modern world rarely intruded. To step inside was to step into another century, one where time itself seemed trapped, circling endlessly like the bloodlines within. Researchers who stumbled upon these families were often unprepared for what they found. Caseworkers, traveling doctors, or curious genealogists documented what they could, leaving behind notes that read less like medical files and more like fragments of nightmares, reports of children with speech so distorted it was nearly unintelligible, adults with intelligence so limited they could not follow the simplest of instructions, entire households where literacy was non-existent, where words passed not through books, but through murmurs and gestures. And still, through all of this, there was an undeniable thread of care. They were not monsters locked in cages. They were families, sitting at dinner tables, tending fires, surviving in the only way they knew how. The outside world, when it did intrude, brought more cruelty than compassion. Journalists painted them as sideshow curiosities, their lives reduced to headlines meant to shock. Neighbors, when speaking in private, described them with words that stripped away their humanity: mutants, freaks, abominations. Few considered the weight of generational isolation or the crushing poverty that had sealed them into this cycle. It was easier to mock than to understand, easier to laugh than to reckon with what their existence revealed about the darker undercurrents of American life. And yet behind the walls of those crumbling houses, the family carried on. Weddings were still arranged among kin, babies still born with familiar faces, voices still echoing across valleys where no outsider dared to linger. The silence that shielded them was not just their own. It was the silence of an America unwilling to confront the rot festering within its forgotten corners. For every skyscraper that rose in the cities, there were shadows stretching deeper in the hills. It is tempting to believe that their story is one of the past, sealed in yellowed photographs and brittle pages. But bloodlines have long memories. What begins in one century can bleed into the next, carrying with it the weight of choices made long ago. And somewhere, even now, those choices still ripple outward, echoing in families who remain hidden from the world, bound by the same silence that has kept their lineage alive. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most, because by now you understand this is not simply a story about deformity or folklore. It is a mirror held up to the darkest truths of human inheritance. In every town, in every county, there are names spoken in hushed tones, families everyone knows but no one dares to confront. And though one family's story may stand out, it is far from unique. Across America, scattered in the forgotten hollows of Appalachia, in the barren plains of the Midwest, in the deep swamps of the South, these lineages existed, repeating the same quiet rituals of survival, bound by the same invisible chains of blood. The deeper one looks, the more disturbing the patterns become. Entire branches of family trees looping back onto themselves, circles without end. Children born into homes where their family name was not just a name, but a prison, a reminder that the world beyond their fence line was not for them. To leave meant betrayal, to stay meant continuing the cycle. And most chose to stay, not because they loved the life they had, but because they did not know any other. The echoes of inbreeding reveal themselves in ways that are not always visible, fragile minds that struggle under the weight of the simplest tasks. Bodies more prone to sickness, lifespans shortened, resilience worn thin, but perhaps the deepest scars are the ones that cannot be measured, the quiet despair of lives lived in repetition, the unspoken knowledge that the world beyond the hills might never accept them, even if they found the strength to step into it. In this sense, the curse was not just in their blood, it was in the way society abandoned them, leaving them to rot in silence while the rest of the country pretended they did not exist. When we look back at these families, it is easy to judge, easy to recoil, but the darker question is not what they were, but what we allowed them to become. What does it say about a nation that prides itself on progress, on freedom, on opportunity, when entire families were left stranded in cycles of genetic collapse? How many were mocked instead of helped, ridiculed instead of understood? And how many still live today, hidden in shadows, carrying forward a bloodline written not by choice, but by confinement? There comes a point in every story where myth and reality blur, and with this lineage, that line was crossed long ago. What began as whispers of strange children in hidden valleys has become the kind of tale that chills even hardened historians. But behind every distorted face and faltering mind was a history of choices made not in cruelty, but in desperation. Poverty chained them to the soil. Religion warned them against outsiders. Isolation bred a fear stronger than hunger itself. And so, generation after generation, the blood folded inward until their very existence became a secret too heavy to tell. When researchers revisited their descendants in the late 20th century, they found a family still living much the same as they had a century before. Their cabin walls leaned as though time itself wanted to bury them. Their voices slurred into sounds that were nearly animal, conversations carried not in sentences, but in broken fragments. The children, some barefoot even in the winter cold, ran through dirt paths with laughter that sounded both innocent and haunting. To see them was to glimpse a part of America untouched by progress, frozen in a cycle that had consumed generations. And yet, even then, even in their most haunting condition, there was something profoundly human about them. They loved, they fought, they wept. Mothers cradled infants with the same tenderness found in any other home. Fathers labored in silence, their hands calloused from endless work. In those small, fractured moments of family, one could almost forget the weight of their lineage. Almost, because no matter how much warmth flickered within their walls, the shadows always remained. Each face carried the unmistakable markers of a past that could not be erased. Each voice echoed the silence of a community that chose to look away rather than intervene. Each step they took was burdened by the visible chains of their own bloodline. And as the world beyond their valley surged into the future, they remained where they had always been, hidden in plain sight, carrying secrets the rest of America pretended not to see. It is tempting to think of them as relics, a grotesque chapter sealed off in the archives of forgotten history. But families like theirs are not ghosts. They are living, breathing reminders of how easily human beings can be trapped by circumstance, by poverty, by tradition. Their story is not just a warning, it is an indictment of the silence that allowed them to endure in such shadows for so long. And so we arrive at the final truth, a truth that many would rather turn away from than confront. America's most inbred lineage was not a fairy tale, nor a grotesque exaggeration whispered by neighbors. It was real, lived out across decades in the dim light of cabins and the silence of valleys where no one dared to look too closely. Their story does not end with a single generation, nor does it fade neatly into the past. It lingers, echoing through bloodlines still alive today, carried by descendants who may never fully escape the shadows of their inheritance. The horror of this family is not in their existence, it is in what they reveal about us. That a nation can preach progress while abandoning its most vulnerable, that communities can claim morality while turning a blind eye to suffering just beyond their fences, that survival, when cornered by poverty and isolation, can warp into something that no longer resembles choice at all. What we are left with is not simply a tale of deformity, but a reminder of how silence breeds monsters, not in the form of the people themselves, but in the legacy forced upon them. Look closely enough, and you will see their story repeated in other forgotten corners, in the mountains, in the plains, in the swamps. Families who lived and died unseen, their tragedies folded away in the pages of county records no one opens anymore. Their faces may not be captured in the photographs that survived, their names may not be carved into stone, but their lives were real. And they remind us that history is not only written in triumphs, it is also written in shadows. The question that remains is not whether their bloodline should have survived, it is whether we as a nation can bear the weight of knowing it did, because their story is not only theirs, it is America's, and it will continue to haunt the land as long as silence allows history's dark truths to pass again and again down through generations. If you've listened this far, you are not the same as when you began. You've carried their weight with me for just a moment, and perhaps that is all we can do, witness the shadows so that they are never forgotten again.